Good morning, everyone. As the kids make their way out, I just want to welcome everybody that is here today. All you who are at home, welcome as well. And whoever may be watching this at a later date, we're thankful for you. It is good to be together right here in the heart of summer. A lot of travel, and so congregation varies from week to week. And it's always a blessing to be together with you as we come to worship God and encourage one another. And so 2 weeks ago, in our Bible Stories for Grown-Ups, we climbed into Noah's Ark, and we learned that the hero was never the boat builder, but it was God and his desire to rescue. Last week, we watched God's faithfulness hold fast through Abraham's imperfect faith. And this morning, that same covenant faithfulness runs down 2 more generations to Abraham's grandson, Jacob, and his 12 sons, through one of the ugliest family stories in the Bible. Maybe you're familiar with the story of Joseph's coat of many colors. If you were around 50 years ago, you might think of this as Joseph's, Technicolor dream coat. The children's version includes a very cool costume and a happy ending. Joseph gets a beautiful coat, he has some dreams, takes a detour through Egypt, and ends up a prince. We have sweetened it almost beyond recognition. But as you read Genesis 37 as an adult, you see it begins with a father playing favorites. Genesis 37, verses 3 and 4. Now Israel, that's Jacob Israel. Now Jacob Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. That's where the story begins. In a home poisoned by favoritism so badly that the brothers cannot manage to say a kind word to their little brother. And the hatred only festered from there. Eventually, they throw Joseph into a pit, they plot murder, they settle for selling him into slavery. And then they dip the cool coat in goat's blood and cause their father to grieve himself sick over a lie that they kept for 20 years. This is not a cheerful tale about a favored son's gift. This is attempted fratricide, human trafficking, and a family rotting with deceit and guilt. And it is precisely in that relational wreckage that God does some of his most important work in the Bible. The first grown-up thing to see is that this is not a story about one villain and one victim. It's a story about a broken family passing its brokenness down over generations. And so where did Jacob Israel learn the favoritism? Well, it was from his own father, Isaac, who loved his brother Esau more than he loved Jacob. And so Jacob grew up as a less favored son, knowing how it feels. It was so bad that he and his mother connived to steal his brother's birthright and blessing. It is a tangled web of a family. And what does he do then when he has his own sons? the very thing that wounded him. He picks a favorite and makes sure everyone knows it. The maxim that the sins of the fathers repeat in their children, it's a powerful one, a popular one over the years. It's not necessarily true. Guilt is not passed down from generation to generation. But the dysfunction and the consequences of sin do often affect the lives of the children. And we know this. We know this from our own family stories and from just seeing it in the world. For some of us, the Christian life becomes a process of sorting through and by God's grace overcoming the hurts and habits handed down to us. The parent who was never enough raises children who feel they're never enough. The home that ran on guilt trips and fear raises another home that runs on guilt trips and fear. And the question Genesis is really asking through it all is, can God's promise survive his own people's sin? Can God's promises survive the sins of his people? Can the covenant God make this promise that he had with Abraham hold up under this much dysfunction? Or will the brokenness finally be the thing that derails the plans of God? And the answer that the story gives again and again is no, that we cannot derail the purposes of God. God's plan is unstoppable. And it's not because the people in it are good. Our prayer is that by grace, God will redeem our broken lives and our relationships so that whatever was handed down will stop with our generation. Me and Mary Beth decided this very early on. We met right after I became a Christian. We got engaged very quickly, got married pretty quickly. Both of us coming from divorced families. She was really devastated as a child through circumstances. I had a whole big drama throughout my upbringing, same. And here we were, just two young kids, happy to be saved, happy to find each other, thankful for a fresh start in our late 20s or whatever. And we decided early on, there's some stuff's going to stop with our generation. Stuff that was handed down to us. And here we are, right, 30 years later. Praise God. And so, as the story continues, Joseph begins to have dreams in which his brothers and his father bow down to him. To make things even worse, Joseph, who's, he's a good guy, but to make things even worse, he seems to brag about the dreams. It does not help the situation. And so, chapter 37, still of Genesis, verse 19 and 20, we have the brothers. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him, and then see what comes of his dreams." Notice what enrages them the most. It's not even the coat. It's not the favoritism. It's the dreams. Because in this story, dreams are how God speaks about the future. And the brothers set themselves, they consciously do this. They set themselves up against God's future. We'll see what comes of his dreams that God gave him. They set out to wage war not only against Joseph, but against God. And that is never a battle that we can win. They throw Joseph into this well, into this cistern, this water-holding pit. And that very pit becomes the first step toward God fulfilling the dreams. And this is the spiritual choice the story lays before us. Can we lean into God's dream? Or do we set ourselves up against it? Either way, we can't stop it. And here's what boggles my mind, and this is true not just for one life and individually, but for all of history. God does not override human freedom. People make real choices, and those choices have real consequences. And yet God is so far above it all, knowing the end, from the beginning from the end, that even our worst decisions can be taken by God and weaved together into his good purposes. God can take our worst decisions, our regrets, our letdowns, our sins, our failures, and while the consequences of those may play out around us, he can weave all of that into that beautiful tapestry of his grace and his future. Human sin and selfishness, even the world's outright evil as a whole, cannot wreck what God has set in motion. And so the only real question left to us is whether we will be like Joseph and lean into the dream, or like the brothers and rage against it. Because either way, God's will be done. And so let's make sure we're on his side. Right? People often want to think, man, I hope God's on my side. Not that, God forbid he be on your side. Right? We need to make sure we're on God's side. But here's where we have to be careful and honest with all of this. Because leaning into God's dream does not mean that your life will automatically go easy. Joseph suffered an absolute roller coaster of difficulties where things seem to go from bad to worse before they rebound. So after being tossed into the pit and sold into slavery, he spends well over a decade as a slave. He rises up to the top of that household, shows great character, great potential, great trustworthiness, only to be falsely accused and then thrown into prison, where he rises up again in the midst of it all. Each time he remains faithful and rises above it. But it's a hard road. And his eventual rise to Pharaoh's right hand comes only after years of going down. In this story, to be raised up always begins with being cast down. And the road to the throne runs through the pit and the prison. It's difficult to accept. But these are not detours from God's plan. They're part of the plan. And Jesus shows us as much. The road to the glorious empty tomb runs through a difficult ministry and then the cross. Jesus said that the seed must fall to the ground and die. before it can grow up and bear fruit. And so the promise of God was never that we would be spared the dark seasons, that we would be spared the difficult roads. It's that God would walk with us through them and then help us rise above them in the end. Even in Joseph's blessed life, there was a cross before there was a crown. And so the choice of faith is not whether we will suffer, but how we carry the suffering when it comes. And whether in the pit or on the pedestal, we keep leaning into the dream of a God who has not abandoned us and who never will. Who will never leave us nor forsake us. And he promised it. And he's proved it time and time again, generation after generation. In a million specific details in my life and in the overarching trajectory of it, he has proven it through Jesus Christ and his resurrection from the dead. When Stephen retells the story that was read for us earlier, that's Stephen's speech before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7. He simply says, because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt. The patriarchs, the brothers. But God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. Acts chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. Which brings us to the sentence that the whole story builds toward. One of the most important sentences in all the Bible. Years later, their father is dead. Joseph's already saved them, to a large part. And the brothers are still, even after he's done so much good for them, the brothers are still terrified that now that their father's died, Joseph's finally going to take his revenge. He has all the power, they're at his mercy. And yet Joseph weeps and says to them, "You intended me harm, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." It's in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. Think about that. After all that time, after things were starting to work out, the brothers' fear and guilt comes back on them, whatever. Joseph does not turn around and say, "Hey, your sin was okay. It really wasn't evil. Things happened for a reason. It all worked out." He doesn't say that. No harm, no foul. He says it plainly. You intended me harm. And then in that same breath, but God intended it for good. Two intentions running through the same events. Theirs murderous, God's redemptive. And God's is the one that prevails. And this is the answer to our earlier question. Can God's promise survive our sin? Not only does God's promise survive, God uses our own shortcomings and reapplies them to be part of his working things out for the good. Whatever kind of mystery that is. In this story, the violence, the trafficking, the prison, God takes the very weapons that were aimed at Joseph's destruction and uses them to position him to save the world and to save his own family from a famine. And that, of course, is a glimpse at the gospel. What Joseph says to his brother, God says at the cross. Sinful people meant the cross for evil. God meant it for the salvation of the world. The worst thing we human beings ever did, killing the Son of God, became the very means of our rescue. And this is the pattern that runs from Joseph straight through Jesus. God working good out of evil, life out of death, salvation out of sin. It does not make evil good. Evil is evil, and it will be held accountable as such. But God's goodness is greater, infinitely greater than evil's harm. And so if you're expecting God's plan to spare you from struggles and mistreatment and suffering, you've misread the story. Because Joseph and Jesus promise us a cross before we get our crown. But hear the other side. That there is no pit so deep that God cannot see you in it. And there is no place in your life so dark that his light can't penetrate into that and bring hope. There is no betrayal so cruel that God cannot redeem you. And no sin so severe that it can't be defeated by God's grace and mercy and purposes for you. You cannot derail the dream of God, and neither can anyone who has wounded you. We've learned that we are the rescued ones from the ark story. And now we learn that the God who rescues is sovereign. And he is so good that he can take every evil done to us and against us and weave it into our salvation. The hero is never us. It's not the favored son. It's certainly not the evil brothers. The hero is the God whose faithfulness runs through the worst that we, our families, our enemies can do, and who can turn all of that around for the good. The pattern of Joseph's life, down and then up, is the very pattern that God offers us. Death and then life. And when we, by faith, are baptized into Christ, we're buried with him into his death and raised with him into a new life. And the descent and the rising both become ours. And so if you have never trusted Jesus and have never been united with him in his death and his resurrection through baptism, then we encourage you to come today and to go down into the water and to be raised up into a new life that God has planned for you. It's Bible stories for grown-ups. We're getting there. Next week, we'll have Moses. And next week, Easton church will be here to worship with us, and we'll have a meal afterward. There'll still be some folks traveling and all. We need to provide plenty of food and all that. They'll come. I'll speak. Lee Hamilton will speak, both about Moses. I'm going to stick with this theme, and then he's going to bring Moses in from a different angle. And so I encourage y'all to be here for that. If you have any needs, need our prayers, want to respond to the gospel, I encourage you to come while we stand and sing.
We will glorify